Hi, it's Dr. Noseworthy back again with another lesson in the unique wellness educational system. Today we're going to be talking about detoxification. Of course, there's a ton of chatter out on the internet and in different health and wellness related books about the importance of detoxification. So we're going to start by painting the big picture and give you some of the information that is based on more of the current research rather than being entrenched in information that is perhaps decades old. So we're going to talk about general concepts of detox. I'm going to talk about the fact that detoxification is highly individual. It's not like we can have one strategy that we apply the same way all the time to every person that we work with, because just like everything else, your detoxification situation and your capacity is unique to you. However, having said that, you will be doing a detox. It is an important part of being well, but we don't know if we're going to be doing that early. We may do it later on. We may do it more than once, and we may do different forms of detoxification. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So let's start with the core four of detoxification. We're going to break this down into four key ideas. We're going to do a reality check, talk about how toxic our environment is. We're going to talk about the two main classifications of toxins, what we call xenobiotics and toxicants. And we're going to talk about toxicity models and testing models, and then talk about some detoxification strategies, simple things that you can do on your own, but also the things that we need to talk about before we commit to a robust detoxification approach. So let's talk about the reality check. The bottom line is that you are toxic. You live in a toxic world. We all do, of course. We're all exposed to the same things. And according to the EPA, our industrial manufacturing systems produce and expel about 10 million tons of chemicals each year. Of course, that's 10 million tons, and each ton being 2,000 pounds. And that equates to about 900 pounds of toxic chemicals being put out into the environment, whether it's the air, the water supply, or the soil, every second of every single day. Now, that's an astonishing number. And if that doesn't cause your jaw to drop just a little bit, then we might need to go over that again. Now, of those 10 million tons, about 20% of those, or 2 million tons, are actually known to cause cancer. And again, if you do the math, that's about 180 pounds of cancer-causing chemicals released every single second of every single day. So there's no doubt that the world that you and I live in today is completely toxic. Now, most of these chemicals are the result of modern manufacturing. And so if we could go back 50, 60, 70 years, you wouldn't see the same environmental burden because these chemicals actually didn't exist. The Environmental Defense Fund goes on to say that we actually don't know how many chemicals are on the market. They estimate it somewhere upwards of about 85,000 different chemicals. But in the blog page that I've referenced down on the bottom of the slide there, they say we actually don't know how many chemicals there are. And there's a very good reason for that, or perhaps a bad reason. According to the EPA, in the bottom left-hand side here, this is just a screenshot from one of the pages on the EPA's website. They basically say that chemical toxicity testing is too time-consuming and it's too expensive, so we really don't fully evaluate all of the chemicals that are in the market for potential effects on human health. And my comment is, you've got to be kidding. Unfortunately, what we're dealing with, you and I, and our kids, we are dealing with what's called a post-market law system. And that basically means that instead of companies having to prove beforehand that the chemicals they use and release into the environment are non-toxic, there has to be enough burden of proof. In other words, enough people have to get sick and make a big enough stink about being sick because of chemicals before they'll even convene some kind of a committee to investigate it. And even then, the conclusions may be, everything's okay anyways. I don't know if you can still do it, but a couple of years ago, you could go to Wikipedia's webpage on a chemical called bisphenol A, and this is one of the main plasticizers used in plastic manufacturing. And there are recordings of the proceedings of a Senate committee, about the toxicity of bisphenol A. Now, researchers are all unified on this. Bisphenol A doesn't belong in our environment because it's toxic. It's a known endocrine disruptor. It will mess up your hormonal systems. And so the Senate committee convened all these international experts on bisphenol A toxicity, and all of the research scientists said, hey, we need to get rid of this stuff. And the committee came back and said, well, we really don't have enough proof to say that this is toxic, so we're going to let companies still continue to make it. So unfortunately, that's the political side of things, and I think we all know where that's coming from. But the reality is that you and I and our families and the people we love have to deal with all of the compounds that are being allowed into our environment just simply because of how the system is geared to work. Now, I mentioned our children. Babies are being born toxic, and here's a screenshot from the website, or a website from the Environmental Working Group. And this is a great website, ewg.org. Chances are we've already talked about the EWG, Environmental Working Group, and their Dirty Dozen and their Clean 15. But they have some research on studies that were done looking at how many chemicals are in the umbilical cord blood of newborn babies. And this study is only a couple of years old. And they quote the study and say, of the 287 chemicals they detected, 180 of those are known to cause cancer in humans or animals, and 217 are toxic to the brain and nervous system. So the first thing is there are almost 300 different kinds of chemicals being found in the blood of our newborn babies. Our children are being born toxic, and I think that this is one of the reasons, and I say one of the reasons, this is one of the reasons why we're seeing so many children with so many health issues that didn't exist 50 or 60 years ago. Because the environment that they're being born into and growing up in is toxic, it's poisonous, and it's affecting our health. So we have to have some kind of a strategy to deal with this for ourselves and for the people that we love. Another part of the reality check is not just the air and the water. It's pesticides and herbicides that are used in the foods that we eat. Believe it or not, volcanoes are a significant source of toxins. As they spew their contents up into the environment, those things settle down into the soil, and that's the soil that we're growing a lot of our food in. And there's a compound called dioxin, which is one of the most toxic compounds known to man. And it doesn't take much actually to kill somebody, but we know that dioxin is actually in our food supply, right? That's very well documented, that there are very small amounts. And there's this concept of tolerated amounts or safe exposure levels, which we'll come to in just a moment, which is really kind of a ridiculous concept. A toxin is a toxin is a toxin. But I want to remind you again about the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. Again, this is from the Environmental Working Group, and they've done some research where they measured the amount of pesticide and toxin residues in certain fruits and vegetables. And the Dirty Dozen basically are a dozen. They've actually added a couple more, so maybe 13 or 14 fruits or vegetables that tend to have higher amounts of toxins. So we really should be buying those organic. And the Clean 15 are ones that have lower amounts that we can probably get away with buying in your local grocery store without the added expense of going organic. So I just want to remind you about that. If you're listening to this video, watching this video, and you don't have access to that information yet, please let us know, and we'll be more than happy to make sure that you have access to that. So what about this? The reality check is you might think, well, holy cow, how can I escape this? And the truth is you can't, but you can't give up either. Because if you don't have any strategies to deal with the toxic environment that you're in, if you don't have a plan and take action, then you're going to end up promoting some of the problems that we're trying to fix. But one of the big ideas here is that we tend to think of detoxification as an event, like I'm doing a detox. Well, the reality is that you're detoxing every single minute of every single day. And in fact, the entirety of your blood volume passes through your liver, which is your main detoxification organ, every 3 minutes. And so detoxification is an ongoing biological process, even though we tend to think of it as an event. Now, we will, through your program, talk about doing a detox, but I want you to keep in mind that you are always detoxing, and that the impact of things like environmental chemicals and toxins, and even things that we generate from our own body, the impact on your health is a mixture of how much you're being exposed to, combined with the efficiency of your detoxification systems. Because if you haven't figured this part out yet, detoxification is a biological process that is subject to abnormalities. It's subject to things coming around and inhibiting that. And we're going to talk about some of these different concepts and models in a little bit more detail coming up. Now let's talk about the two different classes of toxins. Toxins tend to fall into one of two classes called xenobiotics or toxicants. And these are the lines between these are just somewhat a little bit blurred, but I want to try to make a distinction as best I can. So xenobiotics basically are toxins that are either foreign to the body or things that are produced inside the body that need to be excreted. So hormones, etc. So every time you make an estrogen or progesterone molecule, cortisol or testosterone, there's a useful life of that molecule, but at some point you have to break that down and clean it out so that you can make room for the stuff that you're making. So we make stuff, we use it, we break it down, clear it out, and then we make more. And this constant renewal is part of biological life. And so these xenobiotics are either foreign to the body or things that we make ourselves. But the distinction about what a xenobiotic is xenobiotics are things that go through what's called liver biotransformation. Liver biotransformation. And this is really what most people are talking about when they think about detoxification. It's about how the liver has these systems to break compounds down and excrete them. Those systems are actually broken down into three different phases, which we'll review in just a moment. But again, the classification of a xenobiotic, whether it's something from outside or something we produce ourselves, xenobiotics are cleared out by the liver and by the liver biotransformation system. Now, this is contrasted to toxicants. And toxicants are predominantly things that come from outside our body, and those would be these industrial chemicals that we're all exposed to, heavy metals like, of course, mercury or arsenic or all of those different things. And the distinction between toxicants and xenobiotics is that toxicants are not handled through the liver. So you can't do a classic detoxification and boost your liver function with something like, say, milk thistle and expect that to handle mercury levels, because mercury doesn't go through the liver. Mercury and other chemicals and other toxicants are handled through a system that's based on glutathione. Now, glutathione is the major intracellular antioxidant, meaning it's inside all of your cells, and glutathione is what neutralizes things called free radicals. And free radicals are compounds that damage your tissues. And these are caused by inflammation. They're actually caused by the fundamental processes of biochemistry. So as your body is metabolizing, doing stuff, you're making your own free radicals, but you can make more if you're inflamed or if you have chemicals, etc. And glutathione is the antioxidant inside your cells that's used to quench the inflammation in the free radical storm. But glutathione is also used outside of the cells in circulation to bind to and neutralize these toxins that can't go through the liver. So again, we have these two major classifications, all this toxic stuff that either comes to us from the outside or that we make inside, and xenobiotics go through the liver system, toxicants do not. So we can't do a classical liver-based detoxification process and handle things like environmental chemicals and metals. Now, to be really accurate, there are some environmental chemicals that do go through the liver, but there are many that don't. And so we have to have a broad strategy that asks the question, what load are we dealing with? And then how do we best handle those things? Now, here's a breakdown of the different phases of liver detoxification. So on the left-hand side, you have what are called fat-soluble toxins that come into the liver. Remember, the blood is flowing through your liver on a constant basis, and every 3 minutes, the entirety of your blood volume passes through this system. So detoxification is a real-time process, not just an event. But the first phase, which is taking these fat-soluble toxins, is mixing these toxins with a certain kind of enzymes. And the cytochrome P450 enzymes that you see there under phase 1, these are actually a family of enzymes. There's not just one. There's a whole family of different kinds of enzymes that are used to handle different types of toxins. And they, from a chemical standpoint, they go through oxidation, reduction, or hydration. These are just the scientific names for the action of these enzymes on these compounds. The bottom line is, toxins come into the liver, and the very first thing that happens from a biotransformation or detox standpoint is that these enzymes are applied to the toxins to prepare them for phase 2. So it's a sequential process, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Now, phase 2 is where we take the things coming out of phase 1 that have been enzymatically changed and altered, and then we hang stuff on them. We attach molecules to them, like a sulfur molecule or glucuronic acid or glutathione. And this is a process called conjugation. Conjugation is just adding two things together. And the net result of the phase 2 conjugation is when you add these other molecules to things coming out of phase 1, it makes them physically larger and it makes them on a molecular level heavier. And that is what allows them to combine with urine or bile or in the stool so that we can excrete them, which is phase 3. And phase 3 isn't noted there, but phase 3 is the elimination process, right? So phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So a couple of things to note here. Number one, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of nutrients that are associated with phase 1 and phase 2. Now, I don't want you to think that all you have to do is just take more of these nutrients and you're going to have efficient phase 1, phase 2 pathways. That helps, certainly, but there are other things that these nutrients can't account for, which we'll go through in a second. But I want you to note here, in between phase 1 and phase 2, we have intermediary metabolism. And basically, when we have things go through phase 1 and the enzymes change those initially toxic compounds, some of the intermediate compounds that then are destined to go through phase 2 are actually more toxic than the initial compounds that we started with. And what we know clinically is that some people can have problems with phase 2. Maybe their phase 1 system works really well and they're producing all these toxic intermediates, but their phase 2 system doesn't work. And what ends up happening is we tend to recirculate these toxic intermediates because we don't have an efficient phase 2 pathway to handle what's coming out of phase 1. So that's one of the problems that we see. But I want to point out a couple of things here. And again, these are things that we know from medical research. We see it in clinical practice. We know, for one, that people can have autoimmunity against the cytochrome P450 enzyme family. And what that means, if you're not familiar with the term autoimmunity, it basically means that your own immune system can attack and destroy these enzymes, and you may have an inefficient phase 1 process because of an imbalance and dysregulation within your immune system. And so quite often we see people with autoimmune problems being poor detoxifiers because the cytochrome P450 enzyme family is involved in the autoimmune destruction. Now, that's one thing that goes well beyond how much folic acid or how many flavonoids as nutrients needed for phase 1 can account for, right? You can't just give someone folic acid and then fix their autoimmunity. That's a really big picture discussion. And it may not be necessary for you as an individual, but if it does exist, that's a big picture thing, not something you can fix just with nutrient repletion. Now, in addition to the potential autoimmunity, people can have what are called SNPs. That SNPs is the common way of pronouncing a single nucleotide polymorphism. And that's just a fancy way to say that we have variants in how our genes work. These are basically gene defects. It's kind of a strong word, but these are gene defects that say, okay, we have to make these enzymes, and there are genes that tell our cells to make the enzymes. But if those genes are faulty, the enzyme that comes out of the production process is faulty as well. So we can have an inefficient phase 1 system because we have a lack of nutrients required for phase 1. We can have a phase 1 problem because of a direct autoimmune problem with the P450 enzyme family, or we can have genetic variations in how we make those enzymes that affect their efficiency. So that's kind of the big picture of the phase 1 stuff. Now let's talk about phase 2. Again, there's a whole bunch of nutrients that are needed for phase 2, and if you are deficient in these nutrients, then you can affect phase 2 processes. But above that, I just want to point out a couple of things, because this is really could be a several-hour discussion if we wanted to drive a lot of detail here. But the process of glucuronidation, remember, phase 2 is conjugation. This is adding other molecules to the toxins coming out of phase 1 to make them bigger, to make them heavier so we can get rid of them. And one of those processes is glucuronidation, and that's the process of attaching glucuronic acid to the molecule coming out of phase 1. And glucuronidation is actually blood sugar dependent. Glucuronic acid is a byproduct of glucose metabolism. So if you have reactive hypoglycemia, insulin resistance, diabetes, or a mixture of those things, then we can be pretty sure that your phase 2 pathway, at least with respect to the glucuronidation process, is not working as efficiently. We also see in this list here glutathione conjugation. We just talked about glutathione as being your major intracellular antioxidant. And so the more stress you have, the more inflammation you have, the more you use up your glutathione trying to combat those things, and the less glutathione is left over to participate in your phase 2. And then we have these SNPs again showing up in the methylation process. There's a ton of research right now, and there's a lot of interest out on the internet and the blogging world about these methylation SNPs and the effect that they can have on health. But the research basically says that, if you're Caucasian from an ethnic standpoint, up to 50% or about 50% of Caucasians carry at least one version of a faulty methylation gene. Now, the numbers change based on different ethnicities, but the Caucasian race basically has the highest percentage of potential methylation polymorphisms would be the term, or SNPs. So you can see that there are big picture things that can affect detoxification. And, a lot of people do a detox and nothing happens. And it's either because they're just choosing the wrong type, or they're doing the right thing, just not aggressively enough, or maybe they're not looking to reduce their exposure, and so they're kind of like bailing the Titanic. They're doing a mini detox when they have a huge toxic load that they have to deal with, or they may have gene variants, or they may have autoimmunity. There's several, again, big picture things that can make detoxification an ineffective or inefficient process. Now, what about phase 3 here? There are certainly things that can affect phase 3 as well. Even though we see here elimination happens through urine, bile, and stool, most of it is through bile or gallbladder and stool. Most of the toxins go out through the intestinal system. And so if we're dealing with some degree of constipation, what we might call low motility, whether that's from thyroid issues or your gut's infected or inflamed for other reasons, or maybe the communication between your gut and your brain isn't working as efficiently as it should. If your phase 3 system doesn't work, it doesn't make sense to augment phase 1 and phase 2, because you're just going to back everything up in the intestinal system, and then that gets reabsorbed back to the liver, and we just tend to recirculate the toxins. So in many cases, we have to place strategies for getting the bowels moving consistently before we can really pay a lot of attention to the detoxification process. And this is one of the reasons why we say we don't always do a detox up front. Sometimes we have to do it later because we have other things to put in place first before we can increase your body's ability to deal with either xenobiotics or with toxicants. So that's your phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 liver biotransformation. Remember, this is the process by which we get rid of our xenobiotic compounds. So how do we handle toxicants? Well, I don't have a graphic for this, but it's really quite simple. Things that don't go through the liver are handled by glutathione, as long as we have enough glutathione to participate, because remember, glutathione can be depleted by other things. And I'll show you a list in a moment. But as long as we have good glutathione, we can handle the toxicant load we have. It binds to it, it neutralizes it, and then it does get excreted out through the intestinal system, but it does so without really having to be processed by the liver. Technically, it does go through the liver because all the blood flows through there, but it doesn't get processed through the liver the same way that your xenobiotic system does. But if we're going to talk about glutathione depletion, here's your quick and dirty short list. Chronic stress, inflammation from any source, whether it's your gut or stress itself or hormonal imbalances or blood sugar problems. These are all potential inflammatory drivers. Do you have chronic infections? Do you have autoimmunity? Do you have a really high toxin load and you're just using up your glutathione because there's so much work to do? Do you have a poor diet and so you're not getting the precursors to make glutathione? Or are you, for example, a highly productive worker, or you're in the gym and you're working out and you're exceeding your metabolic tipping point? Now, I'm using this term here with the assumption that you were watching these videos in sequence and the metabolic tipping point should have been defined already, but just in case you got here without seeing that other stuff, the metabolic tipping point is that point at which your daily physical activity and specifically your exercise routine goes beyond your ability to recover. And so you can't handle the inflammatory oxidative stress that's associated with being physically active and being in the gym working out, and your system starts to crash. And of course, part of that is when you exceed your metabolic tipping point, you use up all your glutathione. And again, you can have very little left over to deal with toxicants. And going back to these genetic variants, we talked about methylation in the P450 system. Yeah, there are genes that control your ability to make glutathione. So you may have enough dietary precursors, but if your genes are telling your cells to make faulty glutathione or to make less, then your glutathione system is not going to work as efficiently as it can. What about toxicity in testing models? Well, what dominates the nutritional and wellness world is a quantitative model. Everyone wants to know how high are my mercury levels, or how high is my bisphenol A, or my benzenes, or my styrenes. And from a quantitative standpoint, there are two models that really are kind of driving this thought process. One is some people have high exposure. So, for example, we worked with a gentleman not long before recording this audio and this video here, and he worked in an automotive painting environment, and he never wore gloves, he didn't wear masks, he didn't protect himself, and so he's spraying these paints and paint chemicals all over the place. And so from an occupational standpoint, he had a high exposure because he didn't take precautions. So you can have too many toxins because you either get a high dose over a period of time, high dose in kind of a single exposure, or you can have low dose accumulation. Maybe you're exposed to quote unquote safe levels of a toxin, but if you're constantly exposed over long periods of time, that can accumulate, especially if you have inefficiencies in your capacity to clear things out, and that can become problematic for you. Now, those are strictly quantitative issues, but there's another aspect to this, which is a qualitative issue, and that means that despite the amount of what you have in your system or you're being exposed to, if you have an immune response to a toxin, it doesn't really matter if you have high exposure or not, because your immune system can respond even to low amounts. And so the idea of a normal amount of a toxin doesn't make sense when you look at it from an immunological standpoint. And this is very well published in the literature, and what's used in the medical research is this term called a tilt syndrome. And tilt stands for a toxicant-induced loss of tolerance. And basically what that means is that it doesn't take more of what you already have in you to start reacting. What it takes is a breakdown of your immune system's ability to tolerate what you're already exposed to. So, in a strictly quantitative model, you don't get sick until you have either an accumulation to a certain threshold or until you get an exposure, a really big exposure at one time. But the immune standpoint and the tilt syndrome standpoint, again, this is the current model of environmental toxicity, says you may have a normal exposure, but if your immune system starts to break down in its ability to tolerate what you already have, then you're going to get sick. Now, the chemical tolerance system it's fairly complex, so I'm going to try to simplify it here. A lot of it has to do with how much glutathione you have available to deal with your toxicants. So let's say that you have a normal everyday exposure. You and I are exposed to the same thing. If you lose glutathione, you're going to get sick when I don't, because I'm maintaining my glutathione sufficiency, right? And for whatever reason, we can construct different scenarios that would explain that. But if you lose glutathione sufficiency, you can no longer handle the things you already have in you that you're currently being exposed to, and it doesn't take more of what's already there to start having a problem. Now, the other part of your chemical tolerance system is something called your barrier system, and we tend to talk about and define these in different videos and lectures and lessons, but let me again just define the barrier system very simply. The barrier system is that division between the external world and your internal environment. So it's made up of the lining of your gut, the lining of your lungs and your respiratory system, and what's called the blood-brain barrier, which is the vascular system that surrounds and protects the brain. And so as long as your barrier systems are intact, you tend to be less reactive to things that are in your environment. But if you have a leaky gut, if you have what we could call a leaky lung, like a chronic upper respiratory history, whether it's just recurrent infections or sinus problems or bronchitis or pneumonia, or if you have that blood-brain barrier issue where you've got the brain fog and the poor focus and concentration, which are indicators but not diagnostic of blood-brain barrier issues, then as you lose your barrier integrity, your immune system tends to become more reactive to what's already inside you. So again, it's not having more of the stuff, it's breaking down your tolerance to what's already there. And a big part of this is whether or not you're controlling your inflammatory triggers. So to create a worst case scenario, you may have normal amounts of mercury or benzenes or other compounds, but if you lose glutathione, if you've got leaky barrier systems and you're chronically inflamed, you can lose tolerance to small amounts. And so you may run a chemical toxicity test, whether it's urine or whatever, and everything may look normal, but you're still reacting because you've lost tolerance from an immune standpoint, and you're not reacting because you've had an additional exposure. So what about testing models? Well, there's a lot of docs out there in the alternative world using hair. There's actually little to no research on this. So I can't sit here and say I think that hair testing is a good methodology. I really don't. Blood testing is good, but it's only good for acute exposures. So I'm, industrial accident, I just got dropped in a vat of goo and I want to know if I've got a toxic exposure. Blood is where you need to look for that. Urine testing has been fairly well validated, and that certainly measures what's in circulation, and it's more of an indicator of, say, long-term exposure rather than that acute exposure that would be appropriate to look for in blood. But it doesn't show what we call your body burden, because toxins in your body are in one of two general places. They're either in circulation or they're stored in your tissues. And certain tissues store different kinds of chemicals more readily than others. So you may find that your nervous system or your liver itself and even bone can store toxins with greater capacity than other tissues. And a lot of times when docs are doing urine testing, they'll do what they call a pre and post challenge test, where they'll use some kind of a chelator to pull stuff out of storage so that we can measure it in the urine, right? So if we pull it out of storage, it shows up in the bloodstream, that gets processed, and we can measure that through the urine. And then urinary testing is actually fairly well documented. But here's one of the problems, is that the chelators that pull things out of tissues, at least from kind of a prescription standpoint, things like EDTA or DMPS, DMSA, these are compounds that are used not only in the pre and post challenge, they're oftentimes used in anti-aging or integrative medical clinics as the methodology to get rid of this stuff, right? So you may have an intravenous, you may have capsules, you may have creams in some cases. The problem is the research shows that while these chelators can pull things out of storage, and yes, you will excrete some of that, it says that the vast majority of the compounds being pulled out of tissues gets redeposited predominantly into brain, into bone, and into liver. And so there could be a real problem. And so we want to develop a rational strategy and look at detoxification. And rather than having a knee-jerk reaction and say everybody needs to detox and everyone needs to do the same thing, we have to be very careful and ask questions like, what kind of detox do we need to do? What's the appropriate timing? And is there any circumstance or any case where actually we don't want to do a detox? And that actually is true if you have a certain scenario like with a tilt syndrome. Now, none of these quantitative models, whether it is hair or blood or urine, none of these account for that immune response to even normal amounts, because you can't, with this kind of testing, measure immune responses. All you're measuring is how much stuff do you have in your system, and that may not be okay even if the lab says it's normal, because if you're having that immune response through a tilt reaction, then you're not going to see that on a urine test or a blood test or even a hair test. So here's the bottom line. We have to be really careful, right? We have to look before we leap. We have to think through the process, and we have to do a couple of things, or at least consider them, before we do serious and significant detoxes. And number one is we want to make sure that the blood-brain barrier is intact. That's one of the things that prevents things from being redeposited into the bone or affecting the brain from the get-go. And so we have this thing called a GABA challenge. Chances are we've already discussed this and we've either done it or we've said it's not applicable in your particular case. But before we do any major detoxification, we want to know, is the blood-brain barrier intact? Because if it's not, and we start doing active chelation, we may actually end up dumping more toxins into the brain. So that's step one. And again, if we haven't talked about the GABA challenge and you think it might be appropriate for you because you've got brain fog or other telltale signs, then please let us know. In all the details that we try to manage. Sometimes things get overlooked, but we try to put these things in place when we set up your plan and your strategy from the very beginning. The other thing that we can do to make sure that we're doing things in a reasonable way is to consider doing a test from Cyrex Labs. This is our preferred lab for doing things like leaky gut testing and most of our autoimmune testing. But they have a test that they call array number 11, which actually looks for immune responses to the most commonly researched environmental chemicals as well as mercury and other heavy metals. But I'll tell you that if somebody has an immune response to either these compounds, whether they're metals or environmental chemicals, sometimes it's better to leave them alone, especially if the blood-brain barrier is not working, especially if we have other autoimmunities. Because if someone has an immune response, and I'm just going to pick on mercury because we've already used that. If someone has an immune response, like an antibody production to mercury, if I pull that out of your bone or your liver or your muscles, wherever it's hiding, all I'm doing is I'm creating a target for your immune system to activate against. And if you have a brain issue, if you have another autoimmunity, then that inflammatory response is just going to make everything else worse. And so in some cases, it's better to let a sleeping dog lie, would be the old saying. Sometimes you have to do things beforehand. You have to fix the barrier systems and restore glutathione sufficiency. And so the bottom line is we need to be smart about how we do things and when we do things. Now, what about other issues related to the detox? So the decision points are, what's the timing, frequency, and duration of a detox? Well, again, sometimes we do it up front. Sometimes we do it later in a program because we have to fix certain things first. Sometimes we do a detox more than once. Quite often we do different kinds. Sometimes the detox is a short 3, 4, or 6 week process, and sometimes it's 4 to 6 months. It really is up to you and your unique situation. Of course, we have general support strategies like the classic formulas, nutritional formulas that might support the liver. And then we have very specific approaches that might be specific to a particular kind of chemical. For example, styrenes are handled a little bit differently than maybe toluene, right? And I'm just pulling out some examples just to give you an idea that we have to be a little bit more specific rather than a one-size-fits-all approach. So what about some things that you can do on your own? Well, the very first strategy in handling toxins is avoidance. And you can start on your own by looking at things like cosmetics, personal care products like soaps and shampoos and household cleaners. These all, the standard off-the-shelf stuff, they all contain chemicals and toxins. Some people handle them very well, some people don't. Some people do need to go to the extent of completely revamping the things that they use in their home and in their personal care strategy. Attached to this video, you'll be able to download a PDF that has some instructions where you can go online to a website called emersonecologics.com. That's emersonecologics.com. You'll have to tell them that you are my client, and if you do that, you'll get a 15% discount off anything that you buy on that website. But they do have a whole host of, say, chemically friendly. I don't think you'll get anything on the market that is completely chemical free. Although you can significantly reduce your exposure just by making some good choices. So they have several brands that are designed in and around the concept of household cleaners or personal care products that are less burdensome, let's say it that way. Or, of course, you can pick stuff up at your local health food store, whether it's Whole Foods or something else. Another time to remind you about Dirty Dozen and Clean 15. Go back to that list and make sure that you are buying organic when it's important, or not buying organic if it doesn't make a difference. And the other reminder is to make sure that you're eating clean meats. I have said before that when you're trying to decide how you spend your grocery budget, if we can afford to go organic with everything and hormone antibiotic free on the meat side, great. But if you have to make a decision and prioritize, I would certainly prioritize meats that are hormone antibiotic free before I make any other choices, right? Because there's a lot of research on how those hormones are affecting us. Now, what else? What other things can you do? Well, there's a simple strategy called dry brushing. There'll be an attachment that you can download. It's a very simple strategy. You buy a soft bristled brush, and there are companies that make them. Again, you can buy these at your local health food store. And before you get into your shower or have a bath, you just simply use that brush to stroke along your skin from the extremities towards your chest, towards your core. And really what you're doing is you're encouraging lymphatic flow. And a lot of the toxins are not just in your bloodstream, but they're also circulating through your lymphatic system, which is part of your immune system. ultimately that gets dumped into your vascular system. So it does, all these toxins end up in the bloodstream and they end up being excreted either through urine or through the stool. But dry brushing is a very simple strategy, and it's dry because you do this before your shower. You get in, you have a nice hot shower. Something else that you can think about is making sure that we're straight, or that you're straight on what strategy we're using with detoxification. That's with respect to timing. Is it now? Is it later? Is it multiple times? Sometimes we'll do a very simple detox up front, and then we'll do more complicated or complex strategies as we go through and learn more about how your body's reacting. But there are strategies like coffee enemas. Yeah, kind of a yuck factor, but believe it or not, coffee enemas are heavily used in natural anti-cancer approaches in clinics. And coffee enemas do many different things. One is that they actually increase glutathione production, which is fantastic. But some of the compounds in coffee drive your liver biotransformation pathways, and there's also an impact on improving communication between your gut and your brain. Now, whether or not coffee enemas are appropriate for you, let's talk about that in your one-on-ones. And same thing with supplementation. The decision of when and how to do detoxification is really based on individual circumstance, which is why I'm not telling you a whole bunch of things from an herbal standpoint or a nutrient standpoint that you can do, because right now I have to stay pretty general, and we'll deal with your individual specifics in your one-on-one sessions. So here's your summary. You are toxic and you live in a toxic world. Your liver only handles certain kinds of toxins. Some toxins don't go through the liver. They're handled differently, for example, by your glutathione system. Testing measures quantity, but some people have these tilt syndromes. Some people have immune reactions to even normal amounts, and you can't find that just by simply doing a blood test or a urine test. And then sometimes it's better to leave things alone, because we know that pulling things out of storage can, in some cases, actually flare up problems and make things worse and make them more complicated. And finally, some cases, detox has to be a very well thought out process. I would like to tell you that it is a very simple one-size-fits-all. Just do a cleanse, just do a detox. Well, sometimes it's more complicated than that, and we want to honor the fact that you are unique and special individual. So we have to apply all of our thought processes to that concept. So thanks for listening. Make sure you download all the PDFs that are attached to this. Again, check out emersonecologics.com if you so desire. Think about changing your household cleaners and some of your personal care products to reduce the toxic burden that you're dealing with. And we'll talk to you again very soon. This is Dr. N.